The room went still. No stiller than that. Still like the air before a car crash, before a man pulls a trigger, before a woman says the one sentence that cannot be unsaid. I watched Adrian Moretti's hand, the one resting on the emerald signet ring, stop breathing. He was 54 years old. He had built an empire out of shipping routes, hotel chains, and the kind of silence most men only dream of buying. And right now, in his own private office on the 30th floor, that empire meant nothing to him at all. Because I had just said, casually like an idiot, like someone describing the weather, "My mother has that same ring." I had walked into that room as Alina Vale, 36, forensic auditor hired to trace missing assets inside Moretti Holdings. I walked out a different woman, and I did not know it yet. The only thought I had at that exact second, watching his fingers go white against the leather of his desk, was, what did I just touch? I had been trained to notice reactions. It is what I do for a living. I read the micro-expressions a man makes when he is terrified but refuses to let the terror land on his face. So when Adrian looked at me, really looked at me, as if he were seeing a ghost with chestnut hair and dark circles, and a linen blazer 2 seasons out of date, I knew I had walked straight through a door I could not walk back through. He put his coffee cup down. He removed his hand from the ring. He did not speed up, did not slow down. He asked me what my mother's maiden name had been before she was married. I said I did not know he had asked. He said he had asked, and that I should be patient with him. That is when I knew. That is, when I knew that whatever the next 10 minutes were about to be, they were no longer about money. And the question that followed me out of that room, down the elevator, into the cab, into my apartment, into the long sleepless hours of the night, was the one that would change my entire life. Who am I really, and why did my mother never tell me? The call had come on a Tuesday in early October. A senior partner at Grafton and Shaw, the firm I had worked at for 9 years, closed my office door behind him and asked me to take a job he would not fully describe. He said only that the client was a private one, that the work involved a large family estate with unexplained asset movement, and that the principal was a man for whom discretion was not a value but a survival skill. He said the man's name, and I felt the chair pull slightly out from under me. I did not fall. I am not a woman who falls in public. But I felt it. Adrian Moretti. The shipping magnate. The hospitality owner. The man whose name sat in the margins of half the financial newspapers in the city, but never ever above the fold. He was, depending on which version of the story you believed, a self-made businessman, a relic of an older and quieter kind of power, or something the press had been careful never to print in full. I took the assignment. I told myself I was taking it because the work was technically interesting, a vast estate with hidden drains, layered trusts, corporate structures that looked like Russian nesting dolls. My favorite kind of puzzle. I told myself it had nothing to do with the strange, careful pull I always felt toward families that had more secrets than I had questions. It was a lie. But it was a useful one. My mother, Lucia Vale, raised me alone in a small apartment in Queens with 2 kinds of silence. The first was the silence of a working mother who came home late and kissed my forehead without waking me. The second was the silence of a woman who had cut herself off from her own family for reasons she would never explain to me. I had grown up accepting this the way children accept weather. We did not visit anyone. We did not call anyone. We had no cousins, no aunts, no uncles, no grandmothers with aprons and recipes. Just Mom, my books, and sometimes the sound she made in the kitchen at night when she thought I was asleep, that low sound a woman makes when she is talking to someone who is not there. I asked her once, when I was 16, who my father was. She said he had been a good man, and that he was gone. I asked her once, when I was 21, whether I had any other family. She said no. I believed her then. I believed my mother the way most people believe the floor is solid. I do not remember my mother's hands. I remember her jewelry box. A simple thing, mahogany with a small brass clasp that did not always catch. Inside it, beneath her wedding bands she never wore, and a pearl earring without its pair, There was an emerald ring, old, square, the kind set in a heavy gold signet shape that women born before 1970 would recognize. She never wore it either. I once, as a child, slipped it onto my thumb and felt its weight, and she saw me, and her face changed in a way I did not then understand. Years later, I would understand exactly what that face change meant. But for now, at 36, walking into the 30th floor office of Adrian Moretti for the first time, all I had was the quiet awareness that I had never, in any formal audit, walked into a room where the client looked back at me the way a man looks at a photograph he has been carrying for a long time. Adrian was taller than I had expected and quieter. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, and he offered me his hand without that performative firmness men in his world often practice. He said, "Ms. Vale," and I said, "Mr. Moretti," and we sat across from each other with a leather-bound estate ledger between us. He explained the file. His late wife, Sophia, had died 7 years earlier in an accident the press handled with the kind of scripted brevity wealthy families prefer. The estate had been placed, in the years after her death, into a holding structure designed to fund charitable work, but the structure had begun, very slowly, to leak value. Accounts that should have been stable were producing quarterly statements that did not balance. Subsidiaries that should have been dormant had not filed reports in years. Subsidiary managers were not answering calls. He did not appear emotional at any of this. Adrian Moretti did not appear, in the conventional sense, like anything. He was a man who had practiced being unreadable until it had become his actual face. But when he spoke of Sophia, even by name, even in passing, his hands slowed. I noticed, because it is my job to notice. I told him the work would take 6 to 9 weeks, that I would need unfettered access to the records, and that I would need to interview his closest advisors, his brother, and his nephew, who he identified by full name without elaborating. He agreed to all of it with a single nod, as if he had been waiting for me to lay out the terms so that he could accept them. I liked him in the first 10 minutes. That should have been a warning sign. I have always distrusted liking powerful men. For the next 3 weeks I worked the way I always work, alone, in the cold archive rooms of Moretti Holdings, with a cup of black coffee that turned cold by lunchtime and a yellow legal pad that grew thicker every day. I traced payments that had no origin. I traced signatures attached to transfers that had been altered at the metadata level. I traced shell companies whose stated purpose was offshore optimization and whose actual purpose, in every case I had ever audited, was hiding. The record I found most interesting was buried in a Persian blue folder, marked Sophia Memorial Trust. The trust had been designed, when I read the founding documents, to fund a single mission, an annual women's health initiative across the southern Mediterranean, in partnership with a long-established NGO I had personally audited twice. The trust was supposed to receive yearly distributions from the principal estate. The distributions had been shrinking steadily for 4 years. Each distribution had a signature, and each signature was rigorous, and the recipient organization had been receiving reduced amounts annually without complaint. I pulled a stack of related filings and stared at the discrepancy for an entire afternoon before writing my first preliminary note to Adrian. By the end of that week, I would learn that the note had contained the sentence that would change my life, not because of anything I wrote, because of what he would write back. The next morning he asked me up to the private office. He had, he said, found something. I assumed it was a document clarification. I did not assume it was the ring. He placed it on the desk without comment, sliding it across the polished surface like a poker chip. It was an emerald signet, old square, set in heavy gold. I stared at it. "Recovered from a sealed estate file," he said. "My wife's belongings. We never knew it had been kept separate from the rest of her jewelry." I did not know what to say. But the ring I was staring at was, in shape and setting, in the small chip near one corner of the stone I had always noticed as a child, identical to one I had known my entire life. My mother's ring. The ring she had never worn. The ring I had tried on once, and that had made her face change. I said, before I could think better of it, before my training could stop my mouth, "My mother has that same ring." and Adrian Moretti froze. Not the way a man freezes when he has heard something embarrassing, or when he is calculating whether to be insulted. He froze the way a man freezes when he has just been told, by someone he did not expect to be telling him, that the dead wife he has been carrying in his pocket for 7 years is still somewhere alive in the world, only not alive, only just barely present, in the setting of a piece of jewelry worn by a stranger he has only just met. He did not ask me how this could be. He did not ask me anything at all. He only looked at me with that long, sad, certain look I had been catching glimpses of in the framed photographs his assistants kept on the back walls of the cold archive rooms. Then he asked, very quietly, my mother's full name. Lucia Vale, I said. And where did she grow up? Sicily. Before she came to the United States. She's talked about it only in fragments. Did she have any other children, Ms. Vale, before she had you? He asked this last question in a voice so controlled it nearly stopped being a voice at all. I felt the question land in me like a hand on my wrist. No, I said. Then, I don't know. She never told me. That night I drove to Queens. I did not call first. I let myself into the apartment with the spare key I had carried since I was 19, and I found my mother on the couch with a small lamp on and her hands folded in that way she always folded them when she had been waiting. She had been waiting a long time. I had grown up in this apartment. I knew every sound it could make. Tonight, every sound felt louder, and my mother's silence weighed more than any of them. Mom, I said, tell me about Sophia. She closed her eyes, and for a long moment I thought she was going to deny it again. She had been denying things my entire life with the same gentle, immovable calm. But tonight she exhaled and reached for the small wooden jewelry box on the coffee table and turned the brass clasp open with a key she kept on her keychain. She took out the emerald ring. She did not put it down. I had another daughter, she said. Older than you. From my first marriage. Her name was Sophia. She married a man from this city, a man whose family I had reason to fear. Why? Because they were powerful, Elena. And I am the kind of woman who learned, the hard way, that powerful families do not forgive women who know where their money goes. Go on. Your sister was a kind girl, smarter than I ever was. I went to her wedding. I held her hand before she went down the aisle. I knew, that night, that I would not be welcome at most of the events of her life. Adrian did not make that rule. Sophia's in-laws did. They were polite, but cold. She touched the stone with her thumb. She sent me letters for 3 years. Birthday cards for 2. Phone calls for 1. I cut her off, finally, not because I wanted to, because the day Sophia's first child would have been born, the family began to talk about trusts, estates, who would control what. I realized my granddaughter, and maybe, eventually, you would be safer far away from all of it. She looked at me, finally, the way she had not looked at me in 20 years. I have been hiding you from them your whole life, Elena. I am sorry. I am sorry I chose to do it without asking you. I forgive you, I said. Tell me exactly who Adrian is to me. She told me, slowly, with the small piece of jewelry trembling between her thumb and forefinger. Sophia, my mother's daughter, my half-sister, who had married a Moretti, who had died 7 years ago, whose charitable trust was the very trust I had been hired to audit. I sat in that apartment for 3 hours without speaking. My mother wept once, only briefly. She confessed that she had cut herself off from Sophia's life the year my half-sister's marriage had put both of her daughters, Sophia and me, and the daughters Sophia might one day have too close to a family that played politics with the bodies of its dead. I went home that night and lay in the dark and felt, for the first time in my adult life, that my entire identity had been a partial drawing, and someone had finally handed me the missing half. The next morning I called Adrian. I told him I knew the truth. I told him I was Sophia's younger half-sister, that my mother had hidden the connection, that I had not been hired to manipulate him, and that I was, with his permission, going to finish the audit. There was a long silence. You can stay, he said. But be careful. The people who don't want this audit finished are not the people I trust. I believed him. I did not know yet that he would be proven more right than either of us expected. Over the next several weeks we worked like co-conspirators. I came to his office at 8 in the morning. He had coffee waiting, which surprised me. Powerful men usually have assistants for coffee, and he served it himself, in simple white cups, without ceremony. He handed me files without explanation. He asked me sharp, practical questions that showed he had read what I had written. He did not patronize me. He did not interrupt me. The first time I pushed back on something he had proposed, I saw him blink twice and then smile faintly, and after that he pushed back on me in equal measure. I learned more about him in those weeks than I had learned about anyone in years. He was not a man who spoke about Sophia. He kept a small framed photograph on his desk that I never touched and never asked about. He kept her memory the way a man keeps an old wound that has healed but still hurts in cold weather. He had built an empire that was supposed to honor her, and now he was learning, with my help, that her own family had been quietly treating her estate as a private savings account. I learned something else. I learned that I respected him. I told myself every morning that respect was simply professional. I reminded myself that he was 54, that I was 36, that the only relationship I had with his late wife was blood. I was right about all of it. And I was completely wrong. Matteo Moretti was the second quietest man in the building. Adrian's older brother. 57. Silver hair. Smooth voice. He had the look of a man who had been raised knowing he would inherit things, and the patience of a man who had been forced to wait for them. I met him on the 8th day of the audit, when he came down to the cold archive rooms with a smile and a question. "You must be the auditor," he said, offering his hand. "Ms. Vale," I said. "I'm the auditor." "Matteo," he said. He turned to the assistant with him, a younger man with the same face carved slightly narrower, and said, "This is my nephew, Rocco. He's been helping Adrian with the younger generation of operations." Rocco was 33. He had the look of a man who had been told he was a prince in a kingdom he did not actually run. He looked at me once, looked away, and nodded. He did not shake my hand. In the days that followed, I learned how they operated. Matteo would come by my archive room with friendliness. Rocco would come by with the kind of polished disinterestedness that meant he was making a note of every file I touched. They asked careful questions about my background, my education, my firm. They asked, with a lightness I recognized immediately as tactical, whether I had any personal connection to the family. At first I had none I knew of. Then I did. It happened the way it always does in those families, through someone else's mouth. One of the assistants, a young woman who had worked in Sophia's old office for years, saw a small framed photograph of my mother on my desk. I had carried it as a child reference and went pale. She recognized something. She did not say it in front of Matteo. She said it quietly, 2 hours later to Adrian, on the phone, while I stood 2 rooms away. Adrian did not tell me who had called. He told me only that I should be careful. In the days that followed, Matteo's smiles thinned. Rocco stopped pretending to be disinterested. On the 11th day after I had learned my true identity, Rocco came by my office with a small document case in his hand and a smarmy smile. "We have a small transfer," he said. "Some legacy paperwork for an old subsidiary. The sign-off is just a formality. Adrian mentioned he was happy to have your seal on legacy items." I looked at the document. It appeared to be a routine transfer of funds from a dormant subsidiary to a small charitable project. The dollar figure was modest. The legal language was clean. The reason to refuse it was, at first glance, none. I stamped it. I signed it. I moved on. 3 days later, Rocco came back to my office, this time without smiling. He said, very calmly, that the transfer had come up in an internal review, and that my signature had approved an apparently improper transfer of funds from one of Sophia's estate-linked charities to a private account. He wanted me to explain. I pulled my working copy of the document from the locked cabinet and, line by line, demonstrated what he had hoped I would not notice. The signature block on the original had been altered. The original date stamp on the file showed the document had been created 2 days after my signature. The metadata on the digital file had been overwritten. The approval they were pointing to existed only in a reprinted PDF that had been substituted into the master record after my sign-off. I called for the metadata forensic tools I had built into the audit pipeline, ran them on the actual archived file, and printed the trace. The document I had signed was in the archive. The document they were showing to the family was a planted forgery. I did not raise my voice. I laid out the proof in front of them. I asked Rocco politely to explain why, on the original document, my digital signature was attached to a file with a creation date 2 days later. He left the room without answering. The document came off my desk. The allegation quietly dissolved. I did not report it. I told Adrian there had been a confusion in the logs. He nodded once. He did not ask more. A week later, Matteo arranged for me to be seen meeting with a man he described as a rival broker. The man had an unlisted office, a briefcase, and the kind of carefully rehearsed small talk that makes honest lawyers nervous. I had been invited because Matteo said the man had information about asset trails I should know. I called my firm before the meeting. I insisted counsel be present. I insisted the meeting be recorded. I told the firm's senior partner that I had been invited to a meeting with a man I had no professional reason to know, and that I wanted a public record of every word. The meeting took 90 minutes. The man talked about shipping routes, about pricing pressure, about a way certain records might appear if I asked the right questions. I asked no questions. I took notes. I watched his eyes flicker too many times toward the door. At the end of the meeting, my counsel thanked him for his time and handed me a printed copy of his firm's marketing materials. I never accepted a single document from him. I never made a single commitment. 2 days later, Matteo quietly told Adrian, in front of me, that there were concerns a particular auditor had been seen meeting with associates of a rival family. He did not name the meeting. He did not say I had taken anything. He simply raised the question, the way an attorney raises reasonable doubt. I let him finish. Then I placed on the table my signed statement, my counsel's signed statement, the meeting recording logs, the time-stamped entry and exit logs from the building, and a printed dossier of the man's affiliations. There was nothing, I said. There was never anything. The audit has not, at any point, had any improper contact. Adrian looked at Matteo. Matteo did not meet his eyes. 2 weeks later, Adrian, under pressure I had not yet seen from inside the family, asked me, in the private office, in front of the same ring on the desk, whether I had come into his world already knowing who he was. The question hurt. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I told him that I had spent my entire career being hired by strangers, and that the only way I had learned Sophia's name was through the estate file he had given me and the words his own people had chosen to tell me. I told him also that my mother had hidden the truth, that I had confronted her about it, and that I had not known about my half-sister until his own ring was lying on the desk between us. You will have to forgive me, I said, for having no way of knowing you before you met me. He said nothing. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to. He was a man who had been raised to wait for full contradiction before he would change his mind. But after I left the room, he did something I had not expected. He called the senior partner at my firm and told him the Moretti family would be increasing my retainer and that I was to remain the principal contact for the estate. He had decided. I learned this only later, by email. Matteo, frustrated twice, decided he was done being subtle. At the next family meeting, he raised the question of Sophia's memorial trust. He spoke to Adrian in a voice that was respectful and grave. Adrian, he said, I have to be honest with you. There are concerns about how the trust has been managed since the auditor's arrival. The numbers have moved in ways that don't quite reconcile. Some of the partners are worried. Some of the NGO partners have been flagging inconsistencies. And I'm sorry to say the trail seems to lead back to the woman hired to handle it. Rocco picked it up. He said he had been told by an unnamed third party that I had been making unauthorized changes to the trust's distribution schedule. that I had been the only one with administrative access during the relevant period, that my logbook showed suspicious activity. I let them both finish. I had been waiting for this. I had anticipated a third trap, but I had not been certain it would come in this shape. I had, however, been careful to preserve every email, every log entry, every archive check, every backup. I had been auditing family wealth for nearly 10 years. I knew what a desperate family looked like when it tried to make its auditor the villain. I laid the proof on the table in the order they had hoped I wouldn't. First, I produced the trust's archived correspondence from the 4 years before I had been hired. I produced bank routing tables that showed the distributions to the NGO had been quietly capped each year by the same internal signature. I produced the 4 legacy signatures that, between them, accounted for the full reduction. I produced the memo dated 4 years earlier from a senior advisor inside the family, recommending the trust's redistribution to a private holdings company signed by Matteo in annotated form, countersigned by Rocco in error correction. Second, I produced my own full activity log, timestamped to the minute, showing I had access to no distribution function. I had querying rights. I had read access. I did not have, at any point, the authority to alter a single number. Third, I produced the proof that the trust's archives had been quietly altered, in violation of the trust's own governing document, to look as if the most recent redistribution had happened during my term when in fact it had happened nearly 2 years before I had ever walked through the front door. The room went silent. Matteo tried once more. The auditor's interpretation of these records may differ from the document's original intent. Interpretation, I said, is not a defense against metadata. The trust's distributions were restored. Rocco quietly left the room. Matteo stayed seated long enough to remind Adrian that the family was the family, and that the trust was an internal matter. Adrian said nothing. He didn't need to. It was that night Adrian called me back to the private office. He did not have the ring on the desk this time. He had a new folder. He said, "I would like you to read this. Tonight. Alone." I read it. It was a complete map of what Matteo, Rocco, and a small group of older family advisors had been doing for almost a decade. The map had been put together, painstakingly, by an old accountant who had served Sophia and who had been quietly dying for 2 years. He had left it with his daughter. She had called Adrian that week. Sophia's estate had been quietly routed, through the trust, into private holdings controlled by Matteo. Rocco had been used as the executor for several of the interior transfers. The charitable purposes of the trust had been preserved in paperwork. In practice, more than 40 million in value had quietly migrated from the trust to Matteo's family offices. Some of that money had funded Matteo's lifestyle. Some of it had gone into acquisitions that gave him leverage over Adrian. Some of it had been quietly loaned to Rocco for ventures he had hoped would make him look successful in front of the rest of the family. More painfully, much of the trail had been structured to make Sophia's memory look like a financial liability rather than a legacy. Matteo had framed Sophia's charity, in several internal memos, as a wasteful indulgence Adrian had been pressured to keep for emotional reasons. Rocco had made sure that every reference to Sophia's legacy inside the family's younger generation contained the language "the past is the past." And the worst part, for most of the past 3 years, certain internal documents had referred to me by a name I had not been told, as the residual claim of Sophia's mother. They had known I existed. They had not told Adrian. They had quietly inventoried me, mapped me, watched me, and decided that if I ever crossed into Adrian's orbit, I would be handled exactly the way I had been handled. I stared at the folder for a long time. I felt fury. I felt grief. I felt, for the first time, a kind of dark professional pride. I had been a footnote in their plan, and now I was the reason it had collapsed. I waited until morning. I gave the folder back to Adrian. I told him I had read it. I told him I understood it raised questions about the people closest to him, and that I expected him to make his own judgment about how to handle it. He read it in front of me. He read it a second time. He read it a third time. "Ms. Vale," he said, "your father never knew how to trust anyone. Neither did my brother. Neither did my wife's family. I have been the fool. I have been paying for years for the illusion that blood is enough. I said nothing. He asked me, then very quietly, what I thought he should do. It was the first time, in the entire audit, he had asked me that question. I told him I thought he should remove Matteo and Rocco from leadership. I told him I thought he should restructure ownership so that the trust's charitable mandate was once again protected. I told him I thought he should publicly give me Sophia's sister, Sophia's blood, the person his own family had spent years trying to push out half the empire's governance. He stared at me. I am not asking for revenge, I said. I am asking for symmetry. If Sophia's memory has been treated as a financial liability for a decade, the cure is not more nostalgia. The cure is putting a person in this office who has spent a career protecting legacies. He was quiet for a long time. He stood up. He walked to the window, the way powerful men do when they intend to make a decision they cannot take back. He looked out over the city for what felt like a full minute. Then, he turned and he sat down, and he looked at his hands, and he looked at me, and he said the first honest sentence he had said to me in all of those weeks in this office. If I do this, he said, Matteo will not forgive me. Rocco will not forgive me. The rest of the family will call me a fool who was seduced by an auditor. They will call you a clever woman with a calculated claim. They will say I lost my wife and lost my head. I know, I said. Do you want me to do this anyway? I am not the one who has to live with the consequences of doing it, I said. You are. But yes, I am asking you to do it anyway. Because Sophia deserves it. Because Lucia deserves it. Because the women this empire has been quietly bleeding for 10 years deserve it. And because I deserve it, I added. I know that sounds like something a person should not say in a room where they have no power. But I have earned this room. And I have earned a place in this empire. And I am asking for it. He nodded. Yes. It was the smallest word he had ever spoken. And it was the biggest decision he had ever made. The decision happened, as such decisions do, very quietly. Matteo and Rocco were informed, in person by Adrian, that they would no longer hold formal positions inside Moretti Holdings. Matteo tried to argue. Rocco left the office without a word. The trust's charitable mandate was restored. A new governance structure was announced. Half the principal oversight of the empire was placed under a co-signing authority whose name was written in full at the top of every document the company now produced, Adrian Moretti. Elena Vale. I was announced, internally and externally, as Adrian's co-principal. There was no press release. The families involved would know. And the only people I told personally that night were my mother, who wept again, and Adrian, who simply said thank you in a voice I had not heard from him before. 6 months later, I sit across from him in this same office. The same ring sits in a small velvet case on the corner of his desk. It is no longer there to be evidence. It is there because it belonged to Sophia, and because Sophia was my sister. Our relationship has changed. I have stopped telling myself it is professional. He has stopped calling me Ms. Vale. We disagree about strategy. We argue about who signs what. We argue sometimes beautifully about the future of an empire that was always meant to honor a woman whose blood runs in my own. He asked me, 2 months ago, if I would marry him. I told him no, not yet. I told him I had spent 36 years as a partial drawing. I told him I needed time to know who I was before I added anything else to my name. He accepted the answer. He told me he would wait. He told me he had spent 7 years hiding from Sophia's memory, and that he would rather wait a few more years than have a marriage that began from obligation. He told me that the day I said yes, if I ever said yes, would be the second greatest day of his life. The first had been the day Sophia told him she was carrying a child they would name after her grandmother. That child had not survived. He told me this without tears, as a man who had carried a particular grief quietly for years and was finally allowed to set it down. I sat with him for a long time that evening. We did not speak. I watched the city lights come on through his window, one borough at a time, and I let him not talk, And he let me not fix anything, and somewhere in that quiet the question of whether I would ever say yes stopped being a question and started being a forecast. This is the man I have decided to love. Not because of the empire. Not because of the ring. Not because of the moment he froze in this office and I realized who I was. I love him because he let me earn my place. I love him because he chose truth over blood. I love him because when he had held his brother's hand for 40 years, he could finally let go of that hand and still be Adrian Moretti. I love him because when he asked me the question he had carried for 7 years, will you, he did not pretend the answer was already in his pocket. He let me say no without losing me. And I love him because on a Tuesday in early October, a forensic auditor walked into a 30th floor office to look at a ledger and walked out the heir to half an empire, with a sister she had never known, with a mother who was finally honest, and with the only man who had ever looked at me and asked what I thought the right thing was. She gave me the ring last week. It belongs to you now, she said. The way Sophia's place at my table belonged to you long before I admitted she had one. My mother has that same ring. Lucia has had it all along. And I no longer need to understand why she kept it locked in a wooden box for 36 years, because the ring has been returned to the room where it belongs, and the door my mother closed 30 years ago is finally open again.